It took place on May 28, 1958. There were 109 seniors. They're in this yearbook. Probably the smallest senior class to ever graduate from there. There have been thousands since. But the reason it's small is that if they lived in the hall attendance area, they could stay at Central. I mean, after all, they'd been there 2 years. So these 109 chose to attend hall even if it was their last year. And I have this note here, that Terrell Powell at that point would be superintendent within a few months. He just didn't know it. Now that summer, a great deal of things happened, but I guess maybe one of the main things is there was a vote taken in the school district as to whether they wanted to close the high schools. There actually were 4, if you think about it. There was Tech High, and there was Horace Mann, and there was Central and Hall. And the vote was 19,000 to 7,000. It was an overwhelming vote, close them down. Boy, they really rethink that after a while. Close them down rather than have a little token integration was basically probably not the way they were thinking about it. So that brings us to 58, 59, the second year. Everybody thought there would be school, but pretty soon there wasn't. That vote came kind of late. They closed the high schools. Now we were in the eighth grade that year. The strangest part of that story to me is the football teams of all 3 schools played their full schedule. And they didn't know they were going to get to do that. As a matter of fact, Coach Keppel canceled the second game with, I think, Kingsbury and Memphis again. He canceled it. He thought the season's over. And somehow there was a decision made downtown, let them play. So they played. And there's that amazing story of how the Hall High team won every game. Every game they played, and they played 2 teams in the top division, North Little Rock and Central, first game against Central. And they were undefeated until the first Turkey Day game. And they had a star quarterback named Roland. I don't know if he's kin to our Roland or not. But it was a Hall High Central punt. Central was punting. Anyway, the ball bounced off his helmet, recovered by Central near our goal. They got 7. They won the game 7-0. The very first Turkey Day game. Now those students who scattered all over, that year, they call themselves still the only senior class never to be a senior class. And I know when they do have their reunions, they combine with Central because they had that in common. There was no school. That Turkey Day game I mentioned, they had 5,000 people out there to see it. There wasn't a student body. It's amazing. Oh, and one other quick thing about the lost year, kind of a sad thing, really. According to Sandra Gordy's book, Finding the Lost Year, 93% of the white students found somewhere to go to school. And you all know all those stories. But only 50% of the black students. 50% of them lost the whole year. And hopefully they went back to school. Now that book I mentioned, if you've never heard of this is an excellent study by Sandra Gordy. She's a professor at UCA. What happened when Little Rock closed its public schools? The main title, Finding the Lost Year. And put this down just a minute. One thing that caught my eye in here was something that she says about Nancy Popperfuss. As a matter of fact, Nancy Popperfuss was one of the hall teachers that she interviewed for this book. And see, when they first closed the schools, and some of you will remember this, the television stations offered them time early in the morning, about a couple of hours, I think, to do classes. And let me read you what Nancy Popperfuss said. Nancy Popperfuss, an English teacher from Hall High, recalled the short run of television classes and her involvement in them. What stood out in her mind almost 40 years later was how terror-struck she was that they were going to do this, and her department chair, Ms. Henderson, assigned her the very first lesson in 8th grade American literature. She worried about it all weekend, it says. She still remembered what she wore on camera the first time she got through it. Now, it turned out that, I remember watching some of these. We were in 8th grade. I think Miss Holmes told us, why don't you watch some of these teachers? And anyway, it didn't last. But there was one teacher from Central. Her name was Emily Penton, 35-year-old veteran teacher of history and government. She made the course so interesting that the television station, by public demand, kept her all year, renamed it Miss Emily, and it ran from 7:30 to 8 every morning, long after the rest of the television stuff had ended. So let me go forward. There were many events toward the end of that year and the next summer where they got the schools back open. I'm not going to go into all that, but there was another election. And opening the schools with a few black students at Central and Hall was a lot better than having no high school at all. See where I'm at here. Oh, when they opened back up, I ran across this interesting story having to do with Hall High School. Now, I suppose that the news media may have figured that something would happen at our school when they opened up again, because 3 black students were going to enter the school. I think they were all girls. One of them was Gracetta Thompson's older sister. So you had, this is still kind of hard for me to believe, but you had 100 newspaper people standing around in front of Hall High School to see what would happen. And where I found this was the author Charles Portis. He later would be the author of True Grit. He was a young newspaper reporter that day working for the Gazette. They came to Hall High, about 100 of them, and stood around in little groups of wilted denim and damp mustaches, chattering and picking each other's brains. We stood across the street from the school in the pine trees that come right up to the street. And he says, you know, they would ask each other, what's the poop? And of course, he says the answer was there was no poop. Just conversation and frustration. He even talks about how some of them got hungry over there because they wouldn't let them in the school. Apparently, they had a name tag to let the students in, and you absolutely had to have it because Everett Tucker came there at 11 o'clock with the school board, and they didn't let him in the school. He left his ID at home. It ended up, I had it somewhere, the actual, here it is, what actually appeared in the Gazette about Hall High the next day. Hall High was reopened, integrated for the first time at 9:30 a.m. in an air of calm. So we're back in school. Now, I think the next thing I have here, I kind of jump up a little bit to a little bit, past our time when they built the auditorium. That was the year after we graduated. I just found this interesting that Mr. Powell retired in 1970. Mr. Powell retired in 1970. And the new principal was Weldon Falk. And Falk made the very reasonable suggestion that auditorium be named after Terrell Powell. The board wouldn't do it. I still can't quite understand that they would not name it after him. But they decided to dedicate it to him, whatever that means. And apparently that's when the portrait of Terrell Powell, was given to the school. And I've kind of had my eye on those two portraits. They need some refurbishing. It's my next project, if I can get it done. Okay, I think one of the things I have here next is that there always was somewhat of a connection between Horace Mann High School and Hall High. We may not have known that. One of those connections is I think they had the same architect. If you look at the buildings, they're very similar. But the other one is that when they finally closed it, because pretty much they finally had to close all black high schools. When they finally closed it, some of those students would end up at Hall High School. A few, not as many at first, but pretty soon many of them would end up attending Hall High School. So that begins to happen, in the 1970s. Now that new media center that we met in this morning, and by the way, if you didn't come this morning, you missed a treat because the new principal is amazing. I just hope they can keep him. But anyway, 74 is the year I have on that. Now, I don't know if any of you would remember this, but I do remember it. The date I have is September 11th, 1970. And it has to do with a Razorback game and Hall High School. That day, and it's the only time that Arkansas has ever played Stanford. And Stanford had a high-powered offense, the year after the big shootout. But anyway, big game, national television. Back in that time, apparently, the visiting band could march as well as the home band. Stanford University sent their band to the game, but they didn't come like normal bands. I went back and looked at the newspaper article about this. Half the band showed up either hitchhiking or in 3 or 4 private cars. They didn't have any place to stay, any place to eat. They didn't have much money, and they were a really different group. Well, Weldon Falk and good people of Little Rock, put them up somewhere. He agreed that they could stay at Hall High School. And the newspaper article has a picture of them practicing on the Hall High stage in the auditorium. Now, I didn't find it in the newspaper article, but I remember someone saying that there was a strong marijuana smell in the gym after they stayed there. And I don't know, if you were at that game, they did a halftime show like no other. It was you were there. It was very different. Their drum major ended up in a scuba diving outfit. But I used to use that story when we were covering the 60s, because my students, they knew I was a young person about that time. Mr. Sen, you lived through the 60s. And one of the questions that would always come up was, not always, but were you at Woodstock? And it wasn't a totally terrible question, because we actually had 2 people in the faculty at Humboldt High School who swore they were at Woodstock, and I think maybe they were, except one of them was an Episcopal priest on the side, and I wasn't sure he was really telling the truth about that. But what I would tell them, I'd just kind of look them straight in the face and say, I wasn't at Woodstock. We hardly knew that was happening in Arkansas. But I was at the big shootout, and it would give me a chance to tell them about seeing President Nixon come into the big football game in 1969. So on we go here. I have a note here that in 71, the second totem pole was put up. And I think we had a story, I think I had it in one of the emails a long time ago about the first totem pole and who actually did it and how they went out and got the tree and all. They did that again. Now this second one probably lasted into the 80s. And from what I've heard, it burned. I'm not sure the story is on that. So going on here, I did want to note I've got it here somewhere, but here it is. The only person in our class to go back to Hall High School and teach is, of course, our own Bill Woolley. Distributive education, is that correct? And the school was changing in that period, but as I'll show you, even in the 80s, it still has a lot of those strong qualities that you and I know about. Bill was there, 73 to 81, and then moved on to Dunbar Junior High as an assistant principal. Now, another note I have here is the point in which the new basketball coach took over there, Oliver Elders. He's well known for what he did as a coach, so well known that he was very recently inaugurated into the Arkansas Sports Hall of Fame. And he was the head basketball coach at Horace Mann. There's that Horace Mann connection again. And I've always kind of wondered if he didn't play a role, because I hear very good things about him. And of course, he was the one who coached Sidney Moncrief. There's two big basketball names out of Hall High, Sidney Moncrief and Portis. And Tommy Rowland. So eventually the football power will wane, but the basketball power goes up, and it's still there. Now, a question, and by the way, and you may know this, Oliver Elders, his wife was Joycelyn Lynn Elders, who was U.S. Surgeon General for a while, at least, under Bill Clinton. Elders took the Hall High basketball team to 4 state championships. Now, a question I had, and I just answered it this morning, because when that tour went through the Kirk's Arena, they call it. I asked Coach there, why didn't they name it Elders Arena? And he said, well, Kirk's came after him and was just as successful. And he must have won 4 championships too. So that new arena is named Kirk's Arena, for that reason. We met Sidney Moncrief one night, I think it's about 2000, maybe 2003, 2004, because they had an event at the school to celebrate, what would it be? They're now 60 years, it must have been 50 years. It wasn't very well attended, but Sidney Moncrief was there. Of course, I was sitting at a table and didn't know it was him, and said, wonder when Sidney Moncrief is here. And he was right there at the table. So Kirk's Arena, Super Sid, they called him. And like Coach Elders, he was a very popular student. And of course, y'all know he went on to Fayetteville and then to the pros and so on. A quick note here that the soccer was played first by Hall High School in 1979. And they're very good at that now. They played for the state championship in 6A 2 times over the last 3 years. They lost the final game. And have a note here that they experimented, it says from 75 to 81, with an open campus. Not totally sure what that meant, but it sounds like you could come and go. You didn't have to stay there, student or teacher. You can probably guess that experiment ended with Principal Falk quoted in the paper saying, some could not cope with the freedom. But I do remember that McClellan High School experimented with an open campus, probably lasted about the same amount of time. People in the community, parents, didn't like it. Better to keep it kind of like a jail. Now, at the 25th year, and I noticed that many of you didn't know this, at the 25th year, the PTA, the student council, and so on, they got together to celebrate that. And one of the things they did, a student won a prize for this, was come up with a slogan. So here it is. Hall High, 25 years, the best is yet to come. Well, I'm not sure it quite worked out in many ways, but obviously they were optimistic about the future. The thing that a lot of people don't realize is that they published this booklet, Hall High School, 25 years. And they have a page for every class, and they got a student from that class, just, for a reference. And for a class of 63, it was Julie Dell. I didn't get a chance to ask her if she remembered doing this. Now, one of the things that happened in this booklet that they did, by the way, they printed 2,000 copies, I think, for $5 each. So there's still some around. Someday I'm going to get this one into the archive. Of all the pictures that they could come up with, in the introduction here, football, basketball, whatever, they pulled out one from our year, probably the only time in the whole 60-year history of the yearbooks that a one-finger salute got into the yearbook. Now, I just conferred with two people who are experts on who actually did this one-finger salute. What was the name? I lost the name of who we thought it was. Fletcher Lord. Fletcher is obviously right by Joy Simmons, but Joy disputes that he did it.
No, we did not.
And the only other possible culprit,
That's the one.
G.T. Kellogg. And they put it in here.
If you'll look in your annual, GT went around and grabbed everybody's annual and signed his initials on top of that picture, so. GT, right there.
Now I'm near the end of this because you can't do the whole history. This is one of those kind of funny stories where you run into somebody and there's a connection. I was teaching, U.S. history over at UALR, and the guy before me teaching, freshman English, freshman composition. And I would sit outside the classroom waiting for him to get through, and I could tell that this guy was a really good teacher. And when I'd go in, I finally got to know him and got to talking a little bit, and his name is Frank Thurman. And he mentioned that he had gone to Hall High School. I said, well, when? I think around the early 80s. And he said, well, I've written a memoir. I said, well, did you mention Hall High School? Oh, yeah. Well, it turns out his memoir's title is Before I Sleep, a memoir of travel and reconciliation. It's a very good book, though I'm not a bestseller, I'm sure. But it's interesting to read this because he went to Catholic High a couple of years, but then he was at Forest Heights, then he was at Hall High in, around 84. And some things had changed, some things were the same. I think one of the things that I noticed right off was him saying in here how much good he got, or how greatly he was affected by the English teachers. They gave him a love of literature, and instead of the names that we know, they're new names. And the band director, I had his name, Lorenzo Smith is the band director. The English teacher he mentions is Gail Strange, so these are new ones to us. But it's the same story of high academics, of urging a person to rise up and do more. So Frank started at UALR, but he ended up going to SMU. He applied and got into Oxford, not as an Oxford scholar, but just as a student. While at Hall High, he played in a rock band, but the Hall High band director talked him into also playing his bass guitar with the regular band. Also taught him a lot about jazz guitar, he said. Well, he went to England to school, at Oxford. He learned how to play the lute, which is a Middle Ages instrument. he got so good on it that they asked him to play for Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, which he did. There's a picture in him doing that. There's also a picture in here of him playing the bass guitar on the Hall High School stage. So it finally hit me. I looked at that name, Thurman. I said, we had a Roger Thurman in our class. You know him? He said, Uncle Roger? So he's Roger's nephew. Now, one quick thing that was in his memoir about Hall High, it's kind of sad, but it's also kind of humorous. He said that when he was a student at Hall High School, a small crime ring had formed within the student body. In addition to the drug racket, the campus, particularly the lockers and parking lot, became a frequent target of break-ins and petty theft. Numerous students, including myself, but lost property, usually in the form of sunglasses or jewelry. To add insult to injury, the ringleader of the group began setting up shop in the boys' bathroom. He put up a table, thereupon which he displayed his wares for sale, sunglasses and jewelry at discount prices. And on that table, you might well have to buy back the very items that had gone missing from your locker or your car. He was called the Candy Man. And beneath his dark shades and wide pearly smile was a dangerous young criminal. So things had begun to change, and to tell you the truth, you can go over there and park your car all you want to now. They're not going to, nobody breaks into it. But it does, I think, point out that there were going to be some challenges. And of course, when integration first came in fairly large numbers, there was some problems and some tension. There was even a point, I think it's 71, that they actually had to close the school for one day. But kind of after that, it settled down to a degree. And when you look at those annuals of the late mid-70s, early 80s, I think you actually see a fairly successfully integrated school. But that would not, last. There's a year I have here somewhere. I just noted that it was the year that Pulaski Academy opened, the beginning of the movement towards private schools and so on. A quick note here, the 1993 was the last winning football season. And in the paper in 2013, they noted that there was a single player on the Hall High football team who had even been born the last time they had a winning season. Now, it is a bit of a sad story. All I know to tell you on that is they have a new coach. His name is Van Hoos. He's doing his best. It's a big challenge. They played Russellville last night in Russellville, 48-0. They've won one game this year, but they have that beautiful new field. If you haven't seen that, go by Scott Field. It's amazing what they did there. I was going to end this, because this is enough, with something that Mark Roberts, the new principal, wrote down, actually. We had a community meeting this summer. And many of you heard him talk already, but let me read you what he said. The last 17 or 18 years haven't been particularly kind to Hall High. We, faculty, staff, we hear with annoying frequency, it's not the place it used to be. To add to this, our successes, he says, if any, don't tend to get the same amount of attention as those that come out of Little Rock's prima donnas, Central and Parkview. Hall's history of 60 years, you probably know this already, but in the early years, attendance zones were significantly favorable to us because the city was basically split down the middle between Central, East, Hall, West. Years after, the school attendance zones changed, and students were assigned to schools without regard to where they lived. With that zone partition, Central got parts of the wealthy neighborhoods previously assigned to Hall. The chaos that was brought on by that change undermined parent confidence in our school. in even our school system, which started the migration to private schools. Today, more than 300 students who live in Hall's attendance zone go to Central. As a matter of fact, this morning, in turning in the neighborhood to go to Hall, I saw a sign out front, Central.